Hi! So, just before we start reading, I wanted to come on quickly and just say something in my real person voice. I was looking at my upload schedule, or lack thereof, more accurately, and I've been thinking recently about trying to pick up the pace, but I'm just about to start my 5-week exam, so the pace will not be picked up. And I'm really sorry about this, because I know it's quite annoying when you're listening to an audiobook like this, because it's like reading a book, but without being able to turn the page. So yeah, no one's complaining about this, but I feel the need to explain, because you're all so lovely. So yeah, thank you. Obviously, thank you. I love all your comments. Yeah, thanks. And I've started saying Andromeda now, so there we go. Look at me go. Yeah, so thanks, and enjoy. All the Young Dudes. Sirius's Perspective by Rollercosterwords. Chapter 28. Second Year. Assumptions. The problem with trying to find a solution to his up-and-coming betrothal was that any time Sirius thought about it, his chest got tight, and his throat closed up, and he felt very hot and very cold all at once. It was much easier not to think about it at all, to pretend it wasn't happening, or that it was happening to someone else. In fact, the more Sirius tried to picture it, the more he became sure that he would never be getting married. He couldn't imagine ever wanting to spend the rest of his life cooped up in a house with some girl. So although James had tasked the Marauders with a new mission, they didn't spring into action immediately. Instead, they spent most of the weekend after his birthday indulging Sirius's whims. They listened to Bowie, they explored a secret passage that led from a 4th-floor broom cupboard to a painting near the astronomy tower. They dropped ink-spraying quills into unsuspecting students' bags. He knew that his friends were treading carefully, exchanging worried glances behind his back and treating him a little more gently than usual. But Sirius was perfectly willing to take advantage of the special treatment if it meant he got his way for a full weekend. Peter didn't even whinge once, and he could always be counted on to complain. Besides, the only way to show his friends that he was fine and that they didn't have to tiptoe around him was to act fine. Sirius plastered on a smile and dragged them all into a whirlwind of activity that left them too exhausted on Saturday night to discuss anything having to do with his family. He slept deeply, dreaming that he was choking on platinum blonde hair. It wasn't until Sunday afternoon that his luck began to run out. James was endlessly patient, but Remus and Peter began to have enough of doing whatever Sirius said. After lunch, he suggested that they test out the time delay spell on the dung bombs. He'd forgotten to leave them in the Slytherin common room, what with everything that had happened. Remus groaned. "I do have homework, you know." They were lying in their dorm, Ziggy Stardust playing for the 1,000th time in the background. Sirius threw a sock at him. Swat. Tosser. Peter scowled, darting a nervous glance at Sirius. "Actually, I need to get started on my herbology essay." "Oh, not you too." "You know, I know for a fact that you haven't even started that essay," Remus pointed out. "Why don't we all just go to the library?" "Does maraudering mean nothing to you?" Sirius threw an arm dramatically over his eyes. "Our noble mission, trampled beneath the feet of academic drivel." He could feel Remus rolling his eyes from across the room. "I'll help you, Sirius," James said gamily. "You lads can run along to the library if you want." "Are you sure?" "Yeah, go on, Pete. At least one of us has to write that herbology essay. Otherwise, who will the rest of us copy?" So they split up, Remus and Peter heading off to the library while Sirius and James took the invisibility cloak down to the dungeon. Once there, they ended up splitting up again. The downside to the time delay spell was that they couldn't guarantee there'd be a victim around when it all went off. And if they wanted to cover as much ground as possible before James's Quidditch practice in the evening, they couldn't stay together. James suggested that they leave half the passageways untouched, but Sirius insisted that he'd be sneaky enough to avoid getting caught, even without the invisibility cloak. "Besides," he added, "if someone sees me skulking around, I can just say I came down here to pay a visit to my lovely family, can't I?" It didn't come out quite as light-hearted as he meant it to. His voice was too bitter on the word family. Maybe that's what jinxed it. Or maybe his luck just ran out. Either way, Sirius had just finished tucking his last dung bomb behind a torch when he rounded the corner and ran straight into none other than Regulus Black himself. For a moment they just stared at each other. Then, "Where are your friends? Where are your friends? What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing." Regulus huffed. "I'm on my way to my common room, obviously." Right. Reggie belonged here. Sirius didn't. He tried not to let it sting, but it still did. "So, why are you down here?" Regulus crossed his arms, waiting for an answer. I came to see you." It was the first excuse that popped into his head. Sirius watched his brother's face transform, spite turning into shock, turning to confusion, turning to something guarded, something wary. Since when does he look at me like that? Then there was a pause, and then, "Why?" He grinned nonchalantly. "Why? What, do I need a reason to talk to my little brother?" The words had a strange effect on Reggie. He seemed to droop a little, becoming smaller. "I thought you were mad at me," he said, still somewhat guarded, scuffing one foot against the stone floor. Sirius shrugged. "I am, sort of. You're mad at me, too." "Yeah, sort of." More silence. It was incredible how difficult it was to speak to each other. Reggie used to be the only person in the world he could talk to. Now it felt like their words slid past each other, never really touching. Finally, Sirius spoke. His voice was quiet, even though there was no one around to hear him. "Why didn't you tell me?" It was like pulling teeth, saying it, but Sirius had to. He was glad that Reg didn't ask what he was talking about, because he wasn't sure that he knew himself. "Why didn't you tell me about the wedding? About wanting to be in Slytherin? About the scars? When did you stop talking to me? Why did you stop talking to me?" Regulus smiled, a small, unhappy smile. "Would it have made a difference?" Sirius didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. James had to leave for Quidditch practice, so Sirius found himself alone in the common room. He listened to Bowie again, but it didn't make him feel any better. Eventually, he turned off the record and went to the library to find his friends. Being alone with his thoughts left him too vulnerable. He felt as though he'd been trying his best to hold a door shut while someone banged on it from the other side. As long as he had people around him, helping him, distracting him, he'd be able to manage. But when he was alone, everything he'd shut away threatened to spill back out. Peter was still in the library, working on his herbology essay, but Remus was gone, down to the dungeons to check on his potion. Sirius didn't want to hang out alone with Peter. He was already in a darkened mood, and the small boy tended to grate on his nerves even more when there was no one to act as a buffer between them. Sirius didn't entirely trust himself to be civil. Even the way Peter was holding his quill annoyed him. He couldn't stay in the library, and he couldn't go back to the dungeons, so Sirius ended up back in the common room, feeling very sorry for himself as he lay on the floor with a book. It was something he had brought from home, full of nasty hexes. As he read each one, he imagined using them on some nebulous enemy. Sometimes Snape, sometimes Mulciber, sometimes his mother, his family, his brother. This only served to worsen his mood, and by the time James returned from his practice, Sirius didn't want to do anything but sulk. James tried to strike up a conversation, but he was still in his Quidditch robes, which didn't improve Sirius's mood. Sensing his friend's agitation, James eventually quieted, seemingly deciding that it was best to let him sulk in peace. He settled onto one of the sofas, flicking Zonko's bursting beans into the fireplace and watching them burst into colourful, miniature explosions. Remus found them like this when he returned through the portrait hole, side by side with Lily Evans. "All right, Lupin," James grinned, raising his eyebrows a bit. Sirius frowned. Since when did Remus hang out with Evans? He nodded to the ginger girl before joining his friends, and she gave him a smile and a wave. "Dumped us for Evans, have you?" James asked, smirking. "Potions," Remus replied. "Right. You're friends with her now?" "Sort of," Remus shrugged. "She's all right. Ate you two." This got Sirius's attention. He sat up, affronted, as James exclaimed, "What? But everyone likes us. We're lovable rogues." "She thinks you're show-offs," James gasped dramatically. "How dare she? We'll have to win her over." "Why bother?" Sirius rolled over, going back to his book. "She's friends with Snivelus. She clearly has no taste." He didn't honestly care that much either way, but James seemed to. He asked, "Did she really say that?" She said you think you're God's gift," Remus responded, sounding amused. "What does that mean?" It's a Muggle expression. "It means she thinks you're full of yourselves." James considered this for a second. "She thinks that? Well..." Sirius could hear the smirk in Remus's voice. "You sort of are, to be honest." James laughed at that, and Remus sat down next to him. He grabbed a handful of the Zonko's beans and started flinging them too. And pretty soon they made a game of it, trying to see who could create the biggest explosions by hitting the embers just right. Once they ran out of beans, James cleared his throat. "Forgot to say," he said casually. "Got the owl from Dad yesterday. He's spoken to McGonagall and got permission for you to come and stay at Christmas." "What? Really?" Remus sounded astonished. Sirius frowned down at his book, where he'd reread the same sentence 4 times. He didn't want to think about Christmas right now. "Yeah, doesn't think he can get you away for the summer, though. Sorry." Remus made an incredulous noise at the back of his throat, and when Sirius looked up he was staring at James like the boy had just saved his life. It made something twist in Sirius's chest. "Just waiting for you now, mate." James nudged Sirius's foot. Have you sorted it out with your mum? Say you're going to the Pettigrews again." "Not bothering," Sirius said, returning to his book. "Just going to go to yours without saying anything." He could feel the pause that followed, that his friends were worrying about him. It only served to irritate him further. There was no way he was going to abandon his dignity and plead with his family for the right to spend some time with his mates. In fact, he didn't want to speak to his mother ever again. "Mum won't like it," James said hesitantly. "Don't tell her, then," Sirius said, turning his page. Even though he'd hardly processed a single word, he was going to have to go back and reread it later if he really wanted to learn about how to curse someone so that all their food tasted like toad spit. His friend's nervous energy was palpable from where they sat. Sirius dug his nails into the binding of his book. "I'm fine," he told himself, as if thinking it hard enough could somehow transmit the thought outside of his body and make it true. Chapter 29, Second Year, December Moon. On December 16th, James, Sirius and Remus waved goodbye to a glum-looking Peter as he boarded the Hogwarts Express by himself. He'd wanted to stay back with them, but he couldn't exactly tell his parents that their werewolf friend needed to wait for the full moon to pass. According to Remus, McGonagall had already given them McGonagall had already given him a stern lecture about sharing his secret with anyone else. Since the other 3 boys were all going to the Potters, James had decided that it was best for them to stay together. This worked fine for Sirius. If Narcissa and Regulus thought that he was staying at Hogwarts, it was less likely that his parents would find out about his true plans. He made sure to catch their eye as they boarded the train, daring either of them to try and make him leave with them. They didn't. It was decided that the 3 Marauders would use the Floo network in McGonagall's office to get to the Potters once the full moon had passed. In the meantime, they had free reign of the castle and spent a lot of the time exploring, adding to Remus's map. The Gryffindor common room was almost empty. Only 2 7th years had stayed behind, and they spent all their time in the library revising for their newts, which meant they could play music whenever they wanted, and they didn't have to worry about getting too rowdy during games of exploding snap. There was another reason to be thankful that Gryffindor Tower was so sparsely populated. Every single morning after the 16th, Sirius received a howler from his mother. He threw them all into the fire, and Walpurga's voice screamed demands that he return home into the chimney. It made James uneasy and irritated Remus, creating tension that grew like a tumour into what should have been a delightful Christmas break with his friends. Remus got more irritated as it got closer to the full moon, and Sirius grew angrier with every letter his mother sent, and neither of them knew when to back down from a fight. James had to step in more than once to stop their bickering. On the morning of the 20th, things came to a head. Sirius had just thrown another howler into the fire, and he couldn't stop it from screaming and waking his friends. Remus groaned from his bed. Just right back, for God's sake." He threw a pillow at Sirius, a bit too hard to pass off as playful. "If you think you can escape your birthright in this cowardly fashion, then you have another thing coming," Walpurga Black's voice wailed from inside the chimney, echoing. Sirius's stomach twisted like a knot. "Stay out of it, Lupin," he snapped, flinging the pillow back at his friend. "How am I supposed to stay out of it when it's in our bloody bedroom every morning?" Remus growled, sitting up now. "I'm so sorry to inconvenience you." His voice dipped with sarcasm as he spoke. Remus was being completely unfair. It wasn't as if he could force his mother to stop. Why couldn't his friends understand the amount of pressure he was under? "How about not acting like a spoilt brat for 5 minutes?" Remus said, raising his voice. "You're so bloody selfish." Sirius felt like he'd been slapped. He didn't think, he just lashed out, wanting to hurt his friend, wanting to make Remus feel as awful as he was feeling. "I'm not asking her to send them. At least I actually get the post. At least people care about me enough to—" He didn't get to finish, because Remus had launched himself across the room and knocked Sirius back into the bed, where he'd started hitting him with all his might. "Shut up!" His friend's face was a mask of rage. Sirius had never seen Remus so angry, or, more accurately, he'd never seen Remus so angry at him. Sirius tried to push him away, but Remus was a lot stronger than he looked. He landed a blow on Sirius's left cheek that knocked his head back. Sirius gasped and grabbed for his wand, moving on instinct. "Mordio!" He aimed directly at Remus's face. His friend immediately let go, tumbling backwards onto the bed, clutching his forehead. It was one of the curses out of the book that he'd brought from home. And for a moment Sirius's stomach clenched. He'd never used it before. He didn't entirely know what it was. "You wanker!" Remus yelled, furious. "You deserved it!" "Sirius!" Now James had clambered out of bed. "You cursed him! You bloody cursed him!" Sirius faltered, crossing his arms defensively. "He started it!" "He didn't even have his wand on him!" Remus was now staring at himself in his wardrobe mirror. Half of his face was swollen and red, the skin stretched shiny and taut. It looked painful. Sirius felt a stab of guilt. "Does it hurt?" James asked, moving over to stand by Remus. The other boy shook his head unconvincingly. "I'm going to the hospital wing," he said. "Don't come with me," when James started to follow. He didn't even look at Sirius as he left the room. As the door shut behind him, James muttered, attacking someone who's unarmed is really fucking low, Black. Sirius sat, alone on his bed. James had gone out to the Quidditch pitch to fight. Attacking someone who's unarmed is really fucking low, Black. Sirius sat alone on his bed. James had gone out to the Quidditch pitch to fly a few laps on his broom, leaving Sirius by himself to think about what he'd done. The guilt gnawed at him, making him angry. James wasn't being fair. It wasn't his fault. Remus had punched him clean in the face. He'd had every right to defend himself. His friends knew how awful his parents were, so Remus was being a prat for acting like the Howlers were something he could control, and he had been the one to start it. But as the anger burnt itself out, and Sirius thought about how Remus's face had looked, shiny and red, skin pulled tight, he was left with a sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. James was right. Cursing someone wasn't the same as punching them, and his first instinct whenever he was angry was to start throwing around hexes. Then how was he any different from the rest of his family? If his first instinct whenever he was angry was to start throwing around hexes, then how was he any different from the rest of his family? By the time James returned, Sirius was thoroughly abashed. He apologized as they headed down for lunch. "Look, you were right. What I did," he swallowed. "It wasn't okay. I was angry. I lost my temper. It won't happen again." James gave him a half smile. "I know, mate," he said. "But I'm not the one you should be apologizing to." Once they finished eating, they headed straight to the hospital wing. Sirius was nervous, cringing as Madame Pomfrey rounded on them. "I cannot believe you two," she glowered, hands on her hips. "Cursing your fellow housemate, cursing your dorm mate, for goodness sake. In my day you'd have been flogged, and Professor McGonagall has informed me that you know about his special circumstances. One might think you would have more sense." Sirius's throat felt tight. He hung his head as James apologized, copiously, for both of them, even though he wasn't the one who cursed his friend. Eventually, Madame Pomfrey gave a small shake of her head and scooted them over to where Remus was lying in his pyjamas. They stood awkwardly at the end of the bed, staring at the floor. "We're really sorry, Remus," James started. Remus clicked his tongue. "You never did anything." James kicked Sirius. He forced himself to look up, trying to keep his composure. "I'm really sorry, Remus." He hadn't even thought about the full moon last night. He hadn't thought about anything when he'd cast that spell, except hurting his friend. He hated himself for the cruel twist of satisfaction that he had brought when Remus flinched away. But as Sirius met his eyes, Remus's face softened. "I started it. Sorry I hit you. Sorry about the howler. Sorry your mum's a nightmare. Sorry you're a werewolf." They both laughed, and Sirius felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Will she let you out now?" James asked. "Few hours still, till the moon." Remus's face looked much better. The skin was still a bit red, but it was no longer swollen and irritated. Still, he shook his head. "Nah, she wants to try some new potion." "I didn't know there was a cure." "There isn't," Remus said quickly. "It's just, I think it's to make the transformation, easier." They stared at him, uncomprehending. Remus shifted self-consciously. "Like I think, a painkiller. Muggle ones don't work." "Does it hurt, then?" Sirius asked, curious and a bit shocked. Remus had told them about the scars, but he never considered that transformation itself might be painful. He really needed to do some more research. "Well, yeah," Remus said like it was obvious. He didn't look inclined to elaborate, and the other boys knew better than to ask. Since Remus was stuck in the hospital wing, they decided to spend the rest of their afternoon there. After all, there were no other students around, so it was just as good as the common room. They played a few riotous games of exploding snap before Madame Pomfrey admonished them to quieten down, making them switch to gobstones. When dinner time came around, they kept Remus company, eating the same hospital food that he did. By the time McGonagall came and chased them out, all the drama of the morning had been forgotten, and Remus grinned and waved at them as they left. Sirius went to bed that night feeling grateful for his friends, smiling dreamily at the full moon outside his window. The next morning, Sirius woke up feeling refreshed. He dragged James out of bed, unable to contain his enthusiasm. In a matter of hours, they'd finally be arriving at the Potters. The sun was bright outside, freshly risen, no moon in sight. Even the howler from his mother couldn't dampen his mood. He tossed it into the fire on their way out the door, screams fading behind them as they made their way out of the Gryffindor Tower. Sirius led the way to the hospital wing, a jaunty spring to his step, and stopped dead at the end of Remus's bed. James drew up next to him and gasped sharply. His eyes landed on their friend. Before either of them could process what they were seeing, Remus yawned, eyes cracking open. Sirius forced a smile on his face, not wanting to cause alarm. "All right, mate," James said with a forced cheer. "All right," Remus choked, hauling himself up. He frowned as he took in their expressions and reached for a mirror that Madame Pomfrey must have left on his bedside table. Sirius held his breath as he lifted the glass. His eyes widened slightly, but his face remained otherwise blank as he studied the reflection. The cut was vicious, although it had already been half healed thanks to Pomfrey's ministrations. It started at the inner corner of one eye and stretched all the way over the bridge of his nose, to the bridge of his nose, and diagonally down the centre of the opposite cheek. Sirius felt a bit ill as he tried to imagine what it had looked like fresh. Remus must have nearly clawed his own face off. It had scabbed over, hard and black, surrounding skin red and tender, sort of like it had been yesterday after the curse. "My beautiful face," Remus said weakly. He was clearly trying to make light of it, but the smile he attempted didn't quite touch his eyes, which were dark and flat. "It's not that bad," James said too quickly. "It'll heal really fast, I bet. How did—" Sirius began to speak, but he was interrupted by Madame Pomfrey. She marched over with a stormy look on her face. "You two, back again?" They backed away quickly, as if they'd been caught committing some sort of crime. She pulled the curtains sharply around Remus's bed, blocking them off from their friend. Remus blinked and exchanged a shocked glance with Sirius. From behind the curtain, they could hear the nurse speaking much more gently to Remus. "Ah, you've had a look, have you?" She tutted, and then there was the sound of a liquid unscrewing. "I know it looks bad, but it'll pale just like the others. Should be barely noticeable by the new year." It was hard to imagine. The scar was so prominent, so angry, insisting you look at it. But Madame Pomfrey was still speaking. "Take this with you." There was a soft sound of movement, something set down on the table. "Apply every morning and evening. Does it hurt still?" Remus didn't respond, but he must have shaken his head, because the nurse clucked her tongue spectacularly and said, "Well, even so, it might itch a bit as it heals. Perhaps we could try trimming your nails down next month. Though I suppose the claws come in anyway." She released a frustrated sigh. "Your face must still have been irritated after we got the swelling down." Sirius was going to throw up. "It's fine," Remus said, the words a familiar mantra from his mouth. "Can I go now? I feel okay." "Wouldn't you rather get a bit more sleep?" "No, I'm hungry. I want to go down for breakfast." "Well, fine. Get dressed and off you pop." Sirius's brain was turning slowly into quicksand. All of his thoughts dragged him down, filled his lungs with silt, and made it hard to breathe. "It's my fault," he thought to himself, as the three of them walked down for breakfast. "All my fault," as James desperately tried to maintain conversation, asking Remus if he'd ever been tobogganing before. "Scarred forever, because of me." As they returned to their room to pack, "Because I'm no better than the rest of my family." And James left to see as James left to see as everything was okay in McGonagall's office. Because even if I'm a Gryffindor, my first instinct is to still curse people. Because I liked it, as he threw his things into his spearnet embroidered trunk. Part of me liked it, as he remembered, again, the grim twist of satisfaction that had come with seeing Remus tumble backwards onto the bed. Part of me likes hurting people. He shut the lid of his trunk, wishing he could crawl out of his skin. He wanted to crack himself open and reach inside, to hollow out all the dark parts. He wished he could blame his parents, but a small, scared voice in the back of his mind whispered that it was just him. Just how he was, selfish, thoughtless, cruel. He went to stand behind Remus, waiting for the other boy to finish packing. He hadn't meant to sneak up, but when Remus turned around, he was startled slightly, seeing his friend behind him. "What's up?" Sirius took a breath. "It's my fault. It's my fault," he said, working to keep his voice even. "I heard Pomfrey say so." "Eh?" "Your face. I cursed it. Then you turned and you scratched it." He trailed off, throat tight. "Oh!" Remus raised his fingers to his face self-consciously, and Sirius had to look away. There was an awkward pause. "It's really not your fault," Remus said, words a bit stilted. "I mean, a scratch everywhere else, too. Bound to happen eventually." It didn't make Sirius feel any better. They both knew it wasn't true. "Why'd you do it?" He'd asked it before, studying Remus's scars, but he hadn't understood then, not really. Hadn't been able to picture the pain. The description that must be behind such a frantic self-mutilation. He needed to understand. If he understood, maybe he could fix it. "I don't know. I don't remember." "You don't remember anything at all?" "Not really. I know I'm always hungry, like I've been starving all my life. And angry." "About what?" Remus shook his head. "Just angry." Sirius thought he knew the feeling. "I'm so sorry, Remus," he said, wishing there was anything he could do. That he had a time turner that could take him back. "Oh, shut up." Remus rolled his eyes. "You wouldn't think twice about cursing James or Peter." "Yeah, but you're—" "Don't say it," Remus interrupted him. "Please don't treat me like I'm sick or different or whatever. It's one night a month. If I punch you, you're allowed to curse me, okay?" Sirius smiled despite himself. "Are you saying you're planning to punch me again?" Remus threw a sock at him. "If you don't sort out those blasted owlers, then maybe." Sirius was used to travelling by flue powder. He'd done it all the time growing up, and the strange twisting feeling no longer bothered him. He went last, following after Remus. It was his friend's first time, but the flue powder didn't seem to have much effect on him either. When Sirius stepped through the fireplace, Remus was firmly on his feet, watching James hug his parents hello. Sirius was impressed. The first time he travelled by flue, he'd thrown up on his aunt's carpet. Remus shrank back a bit as the Potters turned to greet their son's friends. But Sirius couldn't stop from smiling, forgetting for a moment all the turmoil of that morning. Both Mr. and Mrs. Potter swept him into a huge, warm hug, exclaiming happily about how good it was to see him again. Sirius felt a swell of emotion. He'd never been welcomed into a home so warmly by his own family. He felt incredibly grateful for their kindness and sincerity. As they separated, Mr. Potter turned to ask his son about how things were going with the Quidditch team. James shot a nervous glance at Sirius, but he was too happy to feel even a smidge of the lingering resentment about his own failure at the trials. "Oh, he's brilliant," Sirius said enthusiastically, launching into account of their most recent game against Hufflepuff. A massacre. James had scored no less than 200 points. His friend beamed at him, and Mr. Potter's eyes twinkled as they became immersed in their conversation. They made their way, chattering, through to the sitting room, past the plush sofas and tall wired windows, that allowed the winter's sunshine to flood through. In the corner, a gigantic Christmas tree twinkled with lights and shiny baubles, keeping guard over a massive stack of brightly wrapped presents. Sirius loved the way the Potters had decorated for Christmas. His own parents always chose the bleakest decor, silver and black and deep emerald, dark and sharp and viciously polished. It was the sort of decorating meant to display wealth, to put one on edge rather than at ease. But although the Potters were certainly wealthy, their home felt cosy and warm. Colourful paper chains and streamers draped from the ceilings, and picture rails, and portraits were wrapped in softly twinkling fairy lights as Mrs. Potter ushered them into their rooms. "For goodness sakes, Fremont, let the boys put their things away before you start planning whatever it is you're planning now." Sirius couldn't stop from smiling, feeling completely at ease for the first time in months. Christmas cards and tinsel were scattered in every room. Visiting the Potters, Sirius could easily see what all the holiday fuss was about. They had their pick of the guest rooms, and Sirius immediately claimed the one next to James. Remus took the next one over, so they'd all be right in a row. It would feel a bit strange. After all, they'd gotten used to sleeping in the same room. But Sirius wasn't going to miss James's snoring. He had just set his things down when he heard Mr. Potter's booming voice from down the stairs. "Come on then, lads. It's been snowing all afternoon, and I've got the toboggans ready."